On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
This episode of Life Science Success is brought to you by 5280 Life Sciences Consulting. If you need help setting your strategy, meeting your operational goals, or are selecting and implementing critical technology in your business, we should talk. Visit 5280lifescience.com to schedule a meeting and find out more.
So today on the podcast, I'd like to welcome Janik Jaskolski. Welcome, Janik.
Hi, Don. Great to have you.
All right. So would you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I'm from Germany. I'm an engineer by training. I study cognitive computer science for a number of years and intelligent systems design, and which basically focuses on understanding neurobiological processes and cognition by building mathematical models that behave and decide in similar ways, which then obviously is also described as artificial intelligence, machine learning, and such. And with that background, we actually ended up doing research in healthcare and also eventually building a startup called Symlytics, which we'll get to in a little while.
Very good. Yeah. Why don't we just jump right into it? Can you tell me a little bit about Semalytix?
Sure. Semalytics stands for semantic analytics, which is a reflection of me and my co-founders having a background first in academia, then as a startup, in natural language processing and trying to understand written text and empowering machines to be able to read written text as well as humans can. And early on, we focused on different use cases in medicine and pharma, because medical text is quite a difficult niche of natural language processing that comes with a lot of immediate value that we can contribute to different stakeholders, let it be drug developers, insurances, but also, and that's part of our biggest motivation, patients. We have this larger vision or hope that at some point humanity will have figured out how to suffer less from diseases. And essentially what we do with our AI is we try to figure out and contribute a perspective that's authentic to patients. How do people actually suffer from diseases day by day when they're not talking to physicians, when they're not participating in clinical trials? So how does a disease, how do treatments affect me in real life? And we try to understand that as best as we can to uncover unmet needs, to understand, call them hidden unknowns, what ails people. And by building this understanding in a really new and super large scale way, we hope to contribute that understanding to help provide patient-centric guidance for therapy design, but also for drug development as a whole.
So how are you capturing that from the patient? I would imagine it would probably be relatively hard to get a patient to tell you quite frequently how they feel under the realm of their very personal life. But in a broad sense, it would be nice to be able to say, hey, I don't feel exactly like myself today, or I still feel some after effects of what I think might be from something I took.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things here. Some studies have shown that up to and exceeding 95% of all health events, that's just simply occurrences of symptoms, but also outcomes of me taking a medication, are actually never really reported by either from patients to physicians and then from physicians to the entities that actually design therapies. So there's a huge gap in knowledge and understanding. And that coincides now with us, with humanity, having developed the internet, and us also collectively deciding that is a really neat way to share information with this added shield of anonymity. If I'm a patient, I know, speaking from personal experience, there's a lot of more difficult or just bad diseases out there, but I have tinnitus, and even back then, 15 years ago, I would go online because there was a lack of information. Physicians couldn't really tell me what to do, or didn't know a lot about this. So I had this inherent motivation to go online, share a little bit about myself, about my situation, but also try to learn from others, try to exchange, find community and compassion as well, which just collectively led humanity to build the biggest global multi-language patient experience data set that we've ever created, without anyone actually being the active driver behind that. It was just a byproduct of how we behave. And with Semalytix, we designed a system that doesn't ask patients, but simply listens to how do patients people in different diseases and different indications talk about their lives, what are their self-reported priorities. Rarely ever will people say, I wish I could reduce the severity of this symptom by 4% or 5%.
Right.
What we care about is, can we play with our children? Can we go outside? Are we independent? How are we feeling throughout the day? How much quality of life is lost every day on a global scale because of diseases? And that the expression of that is rarely ever in numbers. So we try to understand that by listening to what people share by themselves. And we designed the system that actually, because of its nature, is only really interested in these descriptions and not in a lot of the typical metadata that you would collect. Because what we try to assess is, how do different tumor types and what is the phenotypical expression of cancer in an entire population? And we try to understand what do people say about that? And we collect that and analyze that with an AI and natural language processing system in the background.
Very interesting. And then as I understand it, there are actually two sides of your company, right? So there's one side that's focused on the patient goals, and then there's another side that's focused on the physician. What led you to these focus areas for your company?
In parts, just very concretely, in parts market demand, but also there is, in a similar way as a lot of patient priorities are unknown, a lot of physician priorities are equally unknown. Obviously, they don't talk about this online as much as patients would, because just by sheer numbers, obviously, there's just so many more patients than there are physicians on Earth. But we also use the same technology to tap into, and these then are usually proprietary data sources that customers approach us with, to understand transcripts of conversations with physicians or notes that they would fill out themselves. Anything that is unstructured, free from text within the medical domain, our system is really great at reading that and trying to flesh out topics of interest connected with what we already know is relevant in the medical domain. So words, concepts, connections that we know have meaning. And we also say that we map this free-form text onto a controlled terminology where we get inspired by standards that bodies like the WHO or FDA and EMA put forth, definitions, guidance, and such, that we then take and turn into algorithms so that we can capture people discussing these topics, but without the necessity of obviously humans just reading every single word, which just simply isn't feasible, regardless if we look at patients or physicians.
And then I would envision that there are a lot of potential uses for this for the future. Who are some of the main customers for Semalytix?
So we try to work directly with drug developers right now, because there are these two mega trends in healthcare. One, patient centricity, which isn't in itself a new thing. Pharma has always tried to listen to patients in better ways and try to understand them in better ways. But limited by the approaches that existed, it was always a logistically and just economically really hard task, and can fulfill this need in a really new and innovative way. And that also connects to what's now called real world evidence, where both regulators but also the public demand that drug developers prove and show and provide examples of the value that their therapies provide in the real world, not in clinical trials, anything outside of that. And because of those two trends and just an increasing investment, also willingness in pharma to not just comply with that, but really make that a core of their drug development strategies. That's why we chose pharma for now as our primary customers. But down the line, we're also thinking about making use of this understanding that we're generating, maybe for physicians or patients directly. There's a lot of interesting opportunities that can come out of simply understanding, and understanding topics in a really large, really broad way.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I can foresee that there's a real opportunity too, to just in general help the population with, I'm feeling this symptom, and then maybe that's a call to go back to the doctor or something. That there could be a future where companies like yours could actually provide a little bit of the guardrails for us as patients that, hey, these symptoms are actually ones that you shouldn't be feeling. Head back to the physician or switch your medicine or whatever. So a really interesting opportunity for sure.
Absolutely. And also from personal experience, sometimes you're stressed out and something hurts or something starts bugging you and you have to go, yes, this is how it is right now.
Yeah, right.
But actually, you don't recognize that this is actually should be a call to action. Yeah, so I absolutely agree. Healthcare needs to change. Healthcare needs to be closer to and easier to, it needs to be easier for patients to identify when they should actually go to the doctor. Also when they shouldn't, because that's right now, this is quite inefficient. And there are a lot of better ways to deal with that. Not in the least part, COVID actually showed some of that potential. If I would try to get a physician's appointment right now, it's actually quite likely that I'll simply get a call back later at night instead of having to go, which is just just much more convenient. And for the physician, probably also saves. I'm not a physician, so I don't want to put words into anyone's mouth here, but I would assume that this is also more efficient for them and they can interact with more people throughout the day.
Yeah, I'm also not a physician. I certainly don't know the downsides of telehealth, but yeah. I know my wife has had her first few telehealth appointments and she just said it's fantastic. You don't have to go to the office. You don't have to risk yourself. It's a great thing. And yet whenever you're not feeling right, I guess the main point back to your company is when you're not feeling right, the opportunity here is that maybe there would be something else that would be watching over you and maybe helping to remind you, hey, call your doctor or make a telehealth appointment. Great points altogether. With all the focus on, say, data privacy and things like that, with GDPR and HIPAA, how does Semalytix work with regulations like that?
As I hinted earlier, we're actually not collecting metadata at all because we're not interested in it. What we need or what we try to do is, out of patient experience data that they shared in their own voice, we try to derive the same sort of variables that exist in clinical research. Those are like demographic variables like age or gender, but we don't look for that information out of user data, for example. We simply take the narratives, the actual written text, and disregard or simply don't collect metadata. We also, once we have that, we do something that's called pseudo-anonymization. So if I were to say, hi, my name is Janik, I'm a stage 2 melanoma patient, then our system would actually go over this text before we actually store it in any way and even replace my first name with underscore a name underscore. So we try to blanket and blind data even before we store it, in addition to GDPR compliance. Because the data that we collect in the first place, that we capture in the first place, is through our data providers already GDPR compliant. But we go a step further to really be able to operate this data in an ethical way in healthcare. That in essence, it's also, there's a difference between use cases, obviously. If, for example, and there are some companies that try to do this, if you were looking for patients to enroll in clinical trials, which also is a huge problem, even just to find participants, For that, you would have to be able to identify the individual at some point. We're just by nature not interested by that, because we want to explain diseases through tens or hundreds of thousands, up to, with really large indications, millions of patients, where, don't get me wrong here, where the individual simply isn't really of interest. What's of interest is how many people talk about different symptoms, in which severity, what is the importance of their of different facets of quality of life, and how does, for example, the severity of the symptom then impact that. For that, you don't have to tap into individual information. You shouldn't have to.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's one of those things where I know technology can really help us. And I know there are some people that could use technology against us in really bad ways. But I look at things like this and I go, even as a patient, I would probably be sitting there saying, look, I don't care whether or not if you have my information. However, if a company were to use it in a way that I can't personally envision, that would be in some way against me. And I know at least in the US, the one sort of example used to be that the insurance providers now could trace through your family history. And now all of my children, maybe their insurance premiums all are higher because
Right.
I've had cancer or something like that. So those sort of things I couldn't naturally envision, but I listened to the story of what this technology might actually be able to help patients with. And it sounds like it would be really helpful. And it sounds like you guys are doing all the right things from a data privacy standpoint.
We try to. I think it's a huge conundrum to me that patients actually, globally, EU and US, that they have so little control over their own data, right? This is our healthcare history. So why don't we own? That's another whole thing. But in essence, we just try to work with data that's already public by nature, but that's usually data protection guidelines officers that have little to do with what do patients actually care about. And I agree with you. If I could share more information about tinnitus and hopefully get more opportunities to treat that, or contribute to developing opportunities to treat that, I wouldn't second guess that. I would simply say, here's my data and please help, find ways to help people. I think it's really, it's just an opportunity of this byproduct that we as a humanity collectively decided we want to have this global discourse on healthcare, on how we deal with disease, as we have a global discourse on so many other topics. And we try to handle that in the most ethical way that we can come up with. We're based in Germany, so there's also obviously a lot of regulations that other countries don't even have. But that's, from that perspective, it's actually, I think that's an advantage, because we know that if we comply with these regulations that we have here, we're likely going to be complying with regulations around the globe.
Yeah. Starting with that most restricted premise is definitely a bigger challenge probably to start. However, once you're there, more areas of the world probably will accept it. So in terms of a lot of the companies that I talk to right now, especially with COVID and things like that, a lot of the companies would say, hey, look, I've got to carry out lab studies, and carrying those out, are challenging. Certainly clinical trials right now are a definite challenge. What are some of the main challenges that Semalytix has been facing in the current environment?
So since we work in healthcare, everything is always quite slow, especially around business development. We've felt that too. There was a time now in 2020 where simply nothing really happened, because everyone was just scrambling to figure out what's actually happening, what's going to be happening in 6 months from now. So that also hit us, obviously. I think in a way, it showed that healthcare needs to be more digital. And there was already a strong ongoing trend towards more cloud-based solutions, research that you can do in a decentralized way. And I think COVID actually just increased and extrapolated that interest in many different ways. Real-world evidence trials are a really new thing too, in the way that they can be done now. So there's also a lot of pressure still and a lot of results for companies like us to deliver, to prove that the long-term value is really there, and that findings you get from such sources, not just us, but also electronic health records, patient registries and such, that those are on par, or maybe not in the sense that they would replace anything. They can be used in a complementary fashion. And I think that's, to us, is the biggest hope, that we can make it easy and also by comparison cheaper to capture these patient insights so that they can get included into more and different areas. And listening to patients in real time, I think also this year has been a really intriguing facet, because thankfully we don't have a new pandemic every year, but we didn't know a lot about this disease. And there are 7,000 thousand rare diseases where it's even logistically hard to get patients into a room, just 10 people, to talk to them and find out how do they actually live with this disease. And for all those diseases, for all these situations, I hope that the experiences we had this year open the door to simply being able to do this in more instances, being more open to these avenues of research.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I would imagine that, like we've seen with the sort of usage of remote conferencing technologies and being able to capture the real world evidence of patients' views without having to invite them into an office is probably a really good thing for a lot of companies overall. So we're at the point in the show where I like to ask the same 3 questions of every guest. What inspires you?
I'm also, since I'm an engineer, and it's a little bit of a cliche, I'm a huge sci-fi nerd.
There you
So
go.
I love thinking about the future, what would be possible one day, and then I don't have a lot of patience, and then I wish things would happen faster. I love looking at companies like SpaceX and such that really redefine of what we believe will be and is possible within our lifetime. That's a huge inspiration that kind of gets you out of thinking about what is the next little increment that you could contribute, whichever area of life you're active in, and try to think about what if we skip 2-3 iterations and what should exist at that point, and maybe that's a goal that you can capture. Those things are really deeply inspirational to me, and I love building things, which is also why I became an engineer. And yeah, I think startups are this unique overlap of you actually getting an opportunity to contribute to the lives of many people, building something that lasts. Obviously, if you can find something that will actually grow, and then you actually getting to do this, and that's a really satisfying thing, and yeah, just a really awesome way for me to think about what I want to do with my life.
Yeah. Being able to see something come from the creativity in your mind all the way through to something that you can touch and feel and possibly helps us as human beings is it's just a great inspiration in general, I think, in this field. So what concerns you?
I think we have some risks. Most of those are man-made by themselves or by nature. In the most recent time, actually, I got less concerned about those because it slowly becomes apparent, for example, how much we invest in green energy and trying to save Earth from us. But that's always in the back of my mind. Are we actually doing enough to better ourselves, to better our situation, our environment as well? There are a million small things, and sometimes I wonder if life as we build is a little bit too complex to handle, simply because of the velocity and the amount of information we get every day. It's so easy to get distracted, and it's sometimes really hard to focus on just getting to the next step. I like to sometimes just postulate or think about what actually happens due to this wealth of information that we all have access to. We spend less time thinking about, or we think usually less deeply about individual topics, but we think about just a wealth of variety of topics. And that's a new thing. We're really new to dealing with that, and we're figuring it out as we go. And that's really, maybe it's not so much a concern, but it's just a really intriguing. Yeah, it's just a really intriguing moment to be alive and to watch that happening. And there's just a lot of caveats involved in that.
For sure. And then what excites you?
It's really exciting to me to to be able to produce something or to find a new way to do something, and then having people simply say, this is cool. That actually solves what I was struggling with. And that obviously that doesn't have to be an AI system or something. That can start in really small ways. I guess, just progress excites me.
Excellent. Janik Jaskolski, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. I greatly appreciated our conversation here, and I wish you and Semalytix all the luck. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for the invite. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Very good. See, not so bad. It says, thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.